This video is the second of two where I'll be creating a simple character selection scene with Bolt visual scripting. If you missed the first video, check out the link in the top right or in the video description below. In this video, I'll be creating several smaller flow graphs as well as adding some functionality to the character selector flow graph, all with the goal of completing the functionality and adding a little polish to how it works. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone who voted for this topic on my YouTube community page. If you missed the latest poll, keep your eyes open for another one in the near future. But with that said, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to work on is displaying the name of the chosen character, so that when the player selects a character, the name is displayed at the top of the screen. I'll be doing this by getting a reference to the currently selected character, finding the name of the character object, and updating the character name UI element accordingly. To do this, I'm going to make a new scene variable called character name of type GameObject. This variable will hold reference to the character name UI object. Now to update this text element, I'm going to create and use a custom event in the character selector flow macro. Using a custom event will help keep the spaghetti monster at bay, as there are multiple flows that will result in needing to update the character name. With a custom event, the code doesn't need to be duplicated or have multiple flow lines going all over the place. It just needs to call the event. So at the top of the character selector flow graph, I'm going to add a custom event unit, giving it the name of update character name. I'll then drag in a reference to the character list variable, creating a get variable unit. And I'll do the same for the character index variable. Then using a list get item unit, I can get a reference to the currently selected character from the list by connecting the units like so. To get the name of the prefab, I'll use a GameObject name get unit. I'll then drag in a reference to the character name UI GameObject and add a text set unit and connect it all like so. Now if the code calls the update character name event, the name will be displayed in the UI. Before I call the event, I'm going to copy the name of the event so I don't have to worry about typing it in perfectly. And as you may have noticed, I have a spelling error in the name of the event, but I'm just going with it, and it's all the more reason to copy and paste the name of the event. The next step is to call the event. So at the end of the flow that increments up through the list, which is code created in a previous video, I'm going to add a trigger custom event unit and connect it like so, making sure to paste in the name of the event. And in my case, the event is on the same object, so I'll leave the object slot as self. I'll then duplicate the trigger custom event unit and connect it to the end of the code that increments down the list, like so. Now if I test the code, you can see that the UI is updated with the name of the prefab, but it only did this after I pressed either the left or right button, not when the game started. So I'm going to go back in and add a little more code so the name appears when I first press play. Essentially what needs to happen is the event needs to run when the game starts, but I also need to ensure that the character index is set to 0. This isn't an issue the first time the scene is loaded, but if the scene is reloaded, the character index and the character platform will be out of sync. So I'll add a start event and connect a set variable unit that references the character index. I'll then add an integer literal, leaving the value as 0 and connecting it to the set variable unit. The last step is to connect the flow from the set variable unit to the text set unit. With a quick test, I can see that it's working as intended, so now that the character name shows up when I first press play. The next step is to add functionality to the start button so the player can transition to the play scene. To do that, I'll start by creating a new flow macro called start game and attaching it to a flow machine on the start button object in the hierarchy. But before I can load the scene, I need to add the scene to the build settings by going to the file menu and then to build settings, and finally dragging in the two scenes from my project folder, making sure that the character selector scene is the first in the list. With that done, I'll complete the code for the start button. The code is only going to need two units. The first is an on button click event unit, and the second is a load scene unit, and I'll choose the option with a scene index input. I need to make sure to put in the correct index, which in my case with only two scenes is an index of 1. And another quick test shows that the start button is working correctly. Now a quick note on the next scene. I made a mistake when recording the video, not a big mistake, but one that might have you wondering, what's that all about? You may notice that I have a scene variable defined called player spawn point. This isn't used in any of the flow macros, and it was from early experimenting on how to make this whole thing work. I simply forgot about removing it, so you can ignore it. My apologies. Next, moving on to the second scene, or the load character scene, you may notice that the scene makes use of the same terrain as I used in my top-down series of videos, but I've removed all the AI and other such bits, as I'll only be spawning in the prefab. So taking a quick tour of the scene, you can see that I've got a fixed camera looking at an empty game object. This game object will host the flow macro that will spawn the character prefab. You may notice that there is a child that is a cube on the player spawn object. I've used this to help me place the empty object so that it'll be in front of the camera, but I've turned off the cube so it doesn't appear in the game. You can also see a button in the bottom right that I'll use to go back to the character selection scene. The button's going to make testing quicker and easier, and probably not something you would have in a normal game setting. The first piece of code that needs to be created is the code that will spawn the chosen character prefab. So I'm going to create a new flow macro and call it spawn character. I'll attach this flow macro to a flow machine on the player spawn object. In the flow macro, I'll add a start event and then drag out the flow and add a game object instantiate unit. I want the instantiate unit with the option that allows me to set the position and rotation of the newly created object. I'll then drag in get variable units that reference both the character list and character index. I'll then drag out the node from the character list reference, add in a get list item unit, and use the character index reference to set which item I want to get from the list. I'll then connect the list item to the game object instantiate unit like so. This allows the code to instantiate the prefab chosen by the player in the previous scene, but I also need to set the position and rotation of the object. To do this, I'll add a transform position get and a transform rotation get units, connecting them to the instantiate unit. Now, one of the reasons I've used an empty object as a spawn point rather than hard-coding the values of the position and rotation is that it's easier to adjust that empty game object and then have the instantiated object match that position and rotation. It just makes things easier, simpler, and allows for more flexibility if you want to change the spawn point later on. The final step is to change the scale of prefab. This isn't always necessary, but in my case, the prefab needs to be scaled up to make it look right. I'll do this with a transform local scale set unit and set the values to 2.5 on each of the axes. The final piece of code that I want to create is a go back button to make it easier to test the functionality of all the code. To do this, I'll create a new flow macro called go back and add it to the flow machine on the button in the hierarchy. This flow macro will be almost identical to the start button, but will load a different scene. So I'll add a start event and connect it to a load scene unit, making sure that the scene index is 0. With that done, I'm ready to test it all. So I'll go back to the character selector scene and give it a whirl. Now in play mode, if I press an arrow button, I can see that the name of the prefab is displayed correctly at the top of the UI. Then if I press the start button, the scene changes and the correct prefab is loaded into the scene. Using the go back button, I can repeat the process, selecting each of the prefab characters and loading them into the play scene. So there you go. It took a couple of videos, but I've created a simple character selector that can let your players choose their character and load that character into a play scene. If you've enjoyed the video, or better yet, found it useful, please think about hitting the like or subscribe buttons. If you want to go even further in supporting the channel, check out the links to my Discord or Patreon in the description below. So until next time, happy game designing.